It's not often that I take to the airwaves to do a show which has an international component to it, but I thought today with something which one of my viewers drew my attention to yesterday. Now, hands up all those of you who've ever heard of a place called Baluchistan. Right, I hadn't either, right? It's a place that most of us have never heard of. Does that sound familiar? That Scotland's the sort of place that nobody's ever heard of as well. But anyway, Baluchistan is located in southeastern Pakistan, and it represents approximately 40% of the landmass of Pakistan. Now, it also just so happens to be the location of all of Pakistan's extensive natural gas fields, which produce most of the energy required by the people of Pakistan. Now, curiously, or maybe not so curiously, Baluchistan is also the most heavily militarized part of Pakistan. And when you bear in mind what I've already told you about what's located in Baluchistan, you might understand why that is. Now, not only is Baluchistan the location of all these natural gas fields, which supply so much energy to the rest of Pakistan, it's also the location of almost all the fruit and nut production for Pakistan, and that's a considerable amount. Now, when at the end of World War II, when Britain partitioned Pakistan and India into two, Pakistan went obviously off on its own tangent. Baluchistan still existed, incidentally, in 1947 before this happened, and approximately a year later, Baluchistan became a part of Pakistan after a lot of negotiations and a lot of trouble, basically. And so Baluchistan has historically become part of Pakistan and remains so to this day. But if you look at what I've told you already about the history, or the short history of this small nation, which is effectively what it is, it remarkably mirrors what has happened to Scotland since 1707, when it was absorbed into what effectively was Greater England and became part of what's known as Great Britain, and basically a rebadging of England as a new state with Scotland as a part of it. Now, as you know, Scotland holds a lot of the United Kingdom's energy reserves, gas fields, oil fields, renewable energy structures, you name it, Scotland provides a huge amount of it to its neighbour. And this mirrors exactly what is happening in Baluchistan. The difference with Baluchistan, I think, is the fact that it is quite a young country. And because it is such a young country, it is at the stage that Scotland was at with England during the so-called Wars of Independence, when the Scots were resisting attempts to be absorbed by England. Baluchistan is at that stage at the moment where it has basically been taken over by Pakistan. And it would appear, although I don't know all of the history of Baluchistan, that they have been subsumed into Pakistan, which now depends entirely on Baluchistan for all of this natural wealth, the natural energy resources which Pakistan absolutely depends on. It's not the only thing which Pakistan depends upon, unfortunately, though. There is a huge new port which has been built along the massive south coast of Baluchistan, which is hundreds of miles long, and faces south onto the Indian Ocean and allows basically transport ships of enormous size to come in and unload goods and pick up goods for export. Now, this is the major port infrastructure for Pakistan as well as Baluchistan. If Baluchistan was lost to the Pakistani government, it would take with it energy, it would take with it the fruit and nut supply, and it would take with it this gigantic port. And who was it that put up the money for this gigantic port? It was China. China invested in this port in Baluchistan under the aegis of the Pakistani government. Now, here's the interesting parallel between Baluchistan and Scotland. If Baluchistan were to become an independent state again, and basically get its borders back, it would take with it most of the wealth that Pakistan relies upon. But not only that, if it takes this port, Pakistan, which borrowed the money from China to build this port, would be then responsible for all of the debt owed, because that agreement was made between Pakistani's government and the Chinese government. It was not made by any authority in Baluchistan. And so, like Scotland, if it left this larger entity known as Pakistan, and if Scotland left this larger entity known as the UK, neither of these two newly liberated countries would have any debt at all, because they were not the ones who actually created the debt by borrowing money in the first place. The parallels are absolutely remarkable, and in fact, when I looked into this in more detail, I was absolutely struck by just how similar the situation is in Baluchistan. But what's different there is that militarily, they're at the stage Scotland was at, in the early 1800s, from about 1745 onwards, when Scotland was heavily garrisoned with English troops to subdue the people who were rebelling against the Union. Baluchistan is in a similar situation, but it's in it right now. And this rebellion that the Baluchistani People's Liberation Groups are staging is at the same kind of stage that Scotland was at when the English settlers, if you like, the English invaders or occupiers, were attempting to clear the highlands of local inhabitants. And this is precisely what is going on in Baluchistan at the moment. People are resisting, they're fighting back, a guerrilla warfare. Now, the Pakistani government has placed enormous numbers of soldiers all over Baluchistan, and they ruthlessly crush any attempt at resistance. People disappear. People are lifted from their houses in the dead of night, never seen again. There are assassinations. There are attacks from the air and from the ground on suspected locations of rebels. So it's precisely what was happening in Scotland in the 18th century. It's happening in the 21st century in Baluchistan. And this time, the time frame is compressed. So they're fighting for their liberation. They have all the energy resources, and they have a lot of the food resources, and they have the port infrastructure, which Pakistan relies upon. And so because of all of those things, the Pakistanis cannot afford to let them go. And so here the similarities between Scotland and Baluchistan really jump out at you. We're at the stage where the fighting was over 300 years ago, largely, and what we're left with now in Scotland is a civil campaign to free ourselves from the UK. The Baluchistani population is at that earlier stage where they're still physically fighting, they're still shooting, they're still ambushing military convoys in the mountains and things like that. They've got it all at one time, and that is an awful lot harder because the stakes are so much higher. But certainly I'm struck by the amazing similarities between the two countries, except for Baluchistan has started this journey much later in the 20th century than we did back in the 18th century. Can we learn anything from this? Perhaps we can share some of our experiences with Baluchistan, and perhaps those things might help. Certainly an armed rebellion against the might of the Pakistani army is very difficult and unlikely to be won over completely by the rebellion. It would be a resistance, but it would be very difficult to do anything to dislodge the Pakistani military, who are there in huge numbers, as the English army once was in the Highlands of Scotland. So perhaps we can help the Baluchistanis more with negotiating with Pakistan. I don't know, but what's interesting to me is I knew nothing about this until yesterday. The situation, however, in Scotland has changed, as you know. A momentous piece of news was delivered by Professor Black at the Scottish Sovereignty Research Group's conference recently in Dunfermline, where he reversed his views of a lifetime about the political situation in Scotland as he used to understand it over 50 years as a legal expert. He's now the most senior legal figure in the whole of Scotland, and knows more about Scots law than any other living human being. And he has now come out and said, and this is a KC, this is a King's Counsel, one of the top, if not the top legal mind in Scotland, has said that Scotland is a colony of the United Kingdom. All that happened was after the Union Treaty was signed, England did not dissolve itself, but just continued with a slightly different name and absorbed Scotland into its larger kingdom, or its fiefdom, if you like. And so the union never happened. Scotland isn't a partner in the union, it is, in fact, a colony. And that casts everything in a different light. And we also now know, through the SSRG conference, that Justice International for All, which is a campaigning international human rights organization, is taking our case to the UN in New York, and is laying out the case for Scotland to be considered for decolonization to Antonio Guterres, who is the head of the United Nations. And this is them making the case for us to be included in a list of currently 17 countries who are awaiting decolonization under the United Nations programme. And Scotland would become the 18th country on this list to be considered for decolonization by the so-called C24 Committee of the United Nations. So things have changed for Scotland, and it would be nice to think that this kind of experience and this type of approach might be communicated to the people of Baluchistan when it comes to their own struggle to regain their independence from Pakistan. The Pakistani nation as a whole is strangely bereft, if you take Baluchistan out of it, is strangely bereft of natural resources. Baluchistan, incidentally, not only does it have energy, but it also has large quantities of minerals, such as metals like copper, which are vital in the renewable energy field and electric car manufacture and so many other things. But also they have huge access to natural forms of diamonds and other gemstones. So they have colossal potential capital, over $1 trillion worth of value that they could negotiate with. Scotland has a similar quantity, not so much of precious metals, but certainly of energy, with which it can do deals as well. So I thought it was interesting to compare and contrast these two countries today, based on what little I already know from a very short period of research yesterday. But for those of you who are interested in this, I'll try and get some more information on this and present it to you later on. But it just goes to show you that we're not the only country in the world which is struggling to free itself from a larger neighbour, which is basically just taking it over in a hostile takeover. Anyway, that's it from Inde-Car today, but I just thought that was an interesting new perspective based on something which most of us, and a country which most of us have never heard of before. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the programme. If you did, please like, share and leave a comment, and that drives the algorithm. If you can afford to help me with a donation, please use one of the links which you'll find online. I'll try and post a new one today. But in the meantime, as I always say, keep the faith, because if it works for 17 countries already listed for decolonisation, it'll work for Scotland as the 18th, and perhaps even for Baluchistan as the 19th. I'll see you soon. Bye for now.